And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Jason Hewlett, best-selling author, journalist, and broadcaster. He's the director and co-creator of the award-winning paranormal reality series We Want to Believe and the narrator for the UFO Show, both which are on the Paranormal Network. He has a book out on near-death experiences, which we will talk about today, and more. Jason, thank you so much for being my guest, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Jason, how did you get interested in near-death experiences in the first place?
Well, it's funny. It's one of those, because one of my hobbies is I'm a paranormal investigator. So I've always been interested in what happens when we die. And part of that, and I was interested in it as a kid. So it was just something I've always had a fascination with, like watching old shows like In Search of and Unsolved Mysteries and Sightings, and just growing up in an area with reported Bigfoot activity. It's just something I was always fascinated with. But my father passed away when I was 19 and he died of a heart attack. And that kind of really kicked off, wondering what happens when we die. Like, is death the end, or does something continue on? And I'd had, ghostly experiences, been in places where could have been haunting activity and had unexplained stuff happen. So that was kind of built the foundation of having an interest in paranormal and paranormal investigation, which I started doing about 20 years ago, but doing it like quote unquote professionally since 2017 as part of a group, working with Peter, et cetera. And we'd written a book about Peter's life called I Want to Believe: One Man's Journey into the Paranormal. And we were writing a second book. And while writing the second book, we were interviewing various other paranormal investigators about their interests and theories, et cetera. And we were interviewing an investigator out of New York named Angela Artuso. And when she was telling her story, she told of an experience she had that was a near-death experience, basically. And it was so compelling and also kind of frightening and also a little bit like, enlightening. And it was one of those, when we finished the interview and logged off, and Peter's like, wow, that was great. And I said, yeah. I said, Peter, we can't put that story in this book. We need to write a book about near-death experiences, because that story was so compelling that it would become lost in the shuffle of all the other stories just about paranormal investigators' journeys. But if we could tell it as part of a whole book on near-death experiences, I think it would be better served. And so we pitched it to our publisher, which is Beyond the Fray Publishing, and they liked the idea. And we were contractually obligated to write a third book. So that became the next book, which in the end became Dying Light. And so that's really where it kicked off. And then doing this book to research it, we started work on it last October. It took months, like a lot longer to research, because it wasn't just simply telling stories. I wanted to kind of try to cover off just what is death and kind of, for lack of a better word, the death experience. So we talked about, we interviewed people who had like near-death experiencers, a grief counselor, like a neurologist, a physicist, and also just, getting into past lives, like reincarnation, and just trying to kind of give this whole overview of what death could be and what happens to us when we die.
I'm sure you've seen quite a few similarities in the near-death experience. Have you guys ever mapped out like the stages of an NDE? Like first you leave your body, then you go to the black void, then you may go through the tunnel, and then you may go out into the universe, or et cetera, or anything like that?
Well, what we kind of learned, and what helped is Peter actually had a near-death experience himself, right? Like he'd had a liver transplant, and right before the transplant, he'd basically flatlined. And his experience had the similarities that you get. But what we found writing this book is, despite their similarities, the experience is also very subjective, depending on the person and what their life experience is and their spiritual background and whether they're an atheist or a Catholic. And one of the interviews was with Lynn Russell, who was a researcher into near-death experiences. And she's written a couple books herself, and she investigated 2,500 cases of near-death experiences. And she kind of provided good insight. And yeah, there is sort of the stages where, for some, where you do that sensation, you have the out-of-body experience. And then there's the tunnel experience with the light. And then there's, the other beings that are present. And sometimes that too is very subjective. One of the people we interviewed in the book saw someone he was raised Catholic, and that being looked a lot like Jesus. You know what I mean? And then another woman, Mary Helen Hensley, it was like old people, because she'd always had an affinity for older people, right? And then there's Angela's, which was like a man in black, and she didn't have the tunnel, and she didn't have the out of body experience, and she was, for all intents and purposes, awake the whole time, but she was basically dead. So that's what I found most fascinating, is that every case is a little bit different, despite the similar. Even the light changes, from like a dark light to a white light to a clear light. It was really fascinating how, like, despite some being very similar, there was no two that were completely alike.
How have you personally changed after writing this book?
I changed quite a bit, actually, in terms of my view of everything. I think that's what I found most striking. Like what I discovered is that even though I haven't had a near-death experience, like I've never flatlined or anything like that, I had like a spiritual experience that very much mirrored a gentleman named Peter Panagore.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of his near-death experience. And he was talking about, he did the whole where he ended up in the universe. Do you know what I mean? And was expanded to the huge and then contracted and could see kind of the world. But when he decided he didn't want to continue and was basically flicked back to life, he went into this place where he was kind of going back down a tunnel, and there's a bunch of different doorways that could lead. You could kind of go to any life you wanted when you went back. And I had this spiritual experience one night where I'd kind of was relaxing in the basement. I'd kind of gone outside to get some air. It was November, so it was cool. And I climbed into bed. And as soon as I got into bed, just something was wrong. And I just felt almost like I was going to leave my body. And I was freezing, like I was freezing cold, like I'd been outside for hours. And basically it was the same thing. I closed my eyes, and there was like all these options came open to me. And this voice was saying, at this point, you can go wherever you want. You can go to a life where you married someone else. You could go to a life where your father didn't die. All these different opportunities. You choose what kind of life you want from here on in. And I was freaking out, because I've been married for, that point, 12 years. I had like, an 8-year-old son. I didn't want to leave it, but it was just, so I'd like, no, I want to come back. I want to come back. My wife basically had to hold me because I was crying and losing it. And she's like, where were you? Like, I was outside for maybe a minute, but she says, you're freezing, like your whole body is ice cold and you're freezing. And I just was shaking violently. And I kind of eventually calmed down and fell asleep, but I've never forgotten that. So I don't know what happened, but it was very much like a part of like a near death where you can now go on to wherever you want to go in life. You can pick a different reality. You can pick a different, and hearing Peter talk about that just was like getting hit in the head with a hammer. Like I didn't die, but I had an experience that was almost like a partial part of what these other people are experiencing. And that kind of, to me, opened up a whole world of possibilities of what is going on around us.
Well, you're up in Canada, and if it's the winter time, it could be freezing or below freezing cold. Did you just step out and get the newspaper or something and get super cold, or what?
I was been downstairs in the basement. We had the fire going, so it was hot. I was getting ready to go to bed. I went upstairs. I went and stood on the back deck just to look around, and it was November. So it was just above zero. So it wasn't, and I was outside, just like, okay, take a good inhale of breath, kind of just cool down a bit, and then get ready to go brush my teeth and go to bed. But it was something when I came back inside and started, getting changed and brushing my teeth and taking my contacts out, just something I felt there's this weird shift in my body. Something changed. And then by the time I laid down, everything was just starting to shiver. Like I've been outside and I was clothed, so I shouldn't have been as cold as I was. And my wife had said, you feel like you've been for hours, like outside.
Maybe you did have some kind of NDE-like experience. I had a guest one time that was doing a sweat lodge out in the desert of California. And I don't know what the temperature is inside there, but it's obviously pretty hot. And he came out of the lodge, and it was a desert night, so it was cool at night. I don't think it was freezing, but probably that change in temperature may have been very similar to yours, and it just kind of threw his body through a loop, and yours as well. And maybe your spirit didn't like it and popped out for a while.
Maybe, and it was frightening at the time. And I've had like a lot of experiences with death. I was a crime reporter for 10 years. And so, I've seen all manner of nasty things and experienced vicarious trauma. So I think my brain, is open to different possibilities and was always kind of very concerned about what happened. So maybe that too, that but something happened. My body didn't like that. You contemplate a lot of these kind of things anyways. And it opened up my idea. And, as a paranormal investigator, you're automatically open to the possibility of life after death anyway. So maybe it was like the universe kind of showing me something.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was, that shook me up for a very long time. And I've never forgotten it. And so it was interesting to talk with Peter about his experiences and hear about that. And now, I just view life, the universe, as just a very different place, a very wondrous place. And I've kind of become we talk about a lot in the book is like the whole multiverse theory and kind of the different yous. And do you go, when you die in one plane, do you go to a different reality? You know what I mean? Or are you having these experiences? So I think I've become way more spiritual, having researched and written this book.
Do you feel that experience spiritually transformed you in any way?
Absolutely. Yeah. I know now after having that like I'm not scared of dying, which a lot of people who have near-death experiences too, once they have, it's like, cool, man, sign me up. When it's my time, I'm completely okay with it because you're not worried at all. So I've kind of come out of it that way. I felt a lot more at peace with things after that. And it sort of helped in terms of the people I've lost in my life. Like grief kind of lessens a bit because you know that they're somewhere else and you can kind of talk to them when you want to. Like there's a few people we talked to in the book about how like through meditation, you can almost change your vibrational frequency and go to these places anyways. It's just a different plane of existence more than anything. And I know when I've kind of done my meditations, I've received insight, from relatives and, even like, I thought it was corny at first, but your angels and your guides. Well, no, now that I definitely know that there are people that I am convinced there are these other beings out there that are in touch and they're keeping an eye on you. And, my father's around and you can kind of tap into his wisdom if you need to. You just kind of got to quiet yourself enough and just have that patience and just sort of almost change your vibrational frequency, for lack of a better word.
When you were experiencing that, did it seem dreamlike or did it seem more real than even our reality here? Or something
it felt
different?
More real because when you dream, right? Like, and it's, I think sometimes even when you dream, you're tapping into like, your subconscious or experiences you had in a past life, etc., or currently having in a different plane of existence. But that felt real. I think that's what scared me so bad and almost maybe drove like the shivering and the cold. Is just like, this is real. Like this. I'm not dreaming this. I haven't even laid down to go to sleep yet, and this is happening. Like this is real, and it felt hyper real. And what was weird about it is the voice wasn't threatening. It was very calm and very compassionate and but it's like, you have a choice. Like you can choose right now what you want, right? Like you spend your life wondering, well, what happened if I had done this instead or that? Well, you can find out now if you want, but you're leaving here. So how much do you what's more important? I just remember making that decision. No, I like my life right now. I like being with my wife and I like my son and I like, the life we've got and I don't want to go.
Do you think you were just hearing the voice or did you actually feel the voice as well as like, a part of you?
That's a really good question. Because it felt like it was just there. You know what I mean? Like it didn't feel, it kind of felt like it was inside my head. So it wasn't like something standing separate, but there. So I guess in a way it would be like this oneness, really. It was like just something that was just there with me at the time, possibly even inside me.
Was it a separate voice from your own, like like a male with a deeper voice or a female or?
Yeah, it was definitely not like, we have our inner monologues with ourselves. It was definitely not me talking. It was something else. It was male. For lack of a better word, it was sort of more like an angelic sound, right? Like it just wasn't like deeper baritone. It was just something a little bit higher, lighter, for lack of a better word. Which again tied into when researching the book, a lot of the voices, and it was always telepathic. Most of the time it's telepathic communication, right? So it almost felt like one of those telepathic communications that these experiences have had with something. And it was very much that similar voice. Like it was a voice, like with love and compassion and kindness. So it was never like threatening. That's why with Angela's story, it was different because they communicated like we're communicating, lips were moving, etc., with this man in black, but it was still a very even though the man in black was frightening, it was still very calming, etc. So yeah, it was, that's the only way I can explain it. I felt like I kind of had an experience akin to what was in this book, but without, at least as far as I know, anything traumatic causing my body to switch off. It was just this sudden shift in existence, kind of, for whatever reason. Maybe if you say from hot to cold, like, you know, it's warm, you go outside, your body gets a little bit of a shock, like when you jump into a very cold body of water, right?
Right. And you didn't see the being, you just heard it.
Just heard it. And almost the only thing I really saw was like just almost like that tunnel and just these different portals or doorways or other separate tunnels that I could just slide into if I chose to.
Who do you think the being was?
I don't know. that and I still don't. I mean, could it have just been that kind of this divine entity people talk about? Like that's one way that they describe it, or like just you're talking to the universe, or could it have been like a guide, like one of my spirit guides? I still don't know. It was interesting that it happened. Yeah. And the timing of it was really interesting too. Like there was nothing so much, but it had been after the death of my mother. So it was about a month after she had passed away, like maybe even 3 weeks. So maybe that too was on my mind. She had just passed away. Her and I had a tumultuous relationship, weren't that close when she passed. And it could have just been part of me just processing that. And that might have triggered it too, right? Like it's just really, really an interesting thing. That kind of came, I guess, at a time when I needed to have that kind of experience.
Has either one of your parents ever visited you in your dreams?
Yeah, my father had. He has a couple times. And I remember because he died when I was 19. So it was 1991. And it was about 3 or 4 years before I even had a dream where he was in it. We were just driving on the highway going somewhere. It was so many years ago now, it's hard to recall. Then I remember he didn't show up again until about 2017. And I was sort of applying for a new job. I had the interview the next day. I just had a dream where I was back in the house that I grew up in. And the dream was nothing sort of special. It was just something, there was some family gathering and we were talking. And I remember I came in the dream, it was like first person, it was me, and I was coming out of the kitchen and he just sort of stepped in front of me and said, "Hey guy." And it started, and I woke up because he just was so rare. Like I just woke right up and I was just like looking around, like wondering what the heck had just happened. But it was funny. Like it was shocking, but it kind of gave me peace. It's like he was just stepping in and just saying, "Hey, I'm still here. You know, you're kind of on the right path." Like just, you know, he always would say, just roll with it, right? Like just roll with the punches kind of thing. So I thought that was really interesting. He's only shown up twice. And then my mother hasn't, although I've had people say, like, you know, people who are psychics say that she's been around, and I can kind of sometimes feel her influence, although she doesn't show up in a dream, but I can feel her influence. And we were always fought a lot. So it almost seems like she brings some conflict into my existence still from time to time, just making me second guess things or question things or what have you, for whatever reason. So yeah, it's interesting to have those kind of experiences after they've passed on.
From what I've learned so far, it seems like, you know, either a person is just kind of dreaming about someone who's transitioned over in a way that maybe they're processing their past relationship with them, or it's an actual visitation. And I was just kind of curious if, you know, you felt like your father's or mother's was an actual visitation, or you were just processing some old, you know, issue out between you two.
I think with the father, it seemed more like a processing, although it was interesting to have him show up in that dream. And all he did was come in and say hi. And that was literally it. It was over. With mom, it has been more of a visitation, I think, the few times. I know that house that I grew up in, I stayed in it after he had passed away, and he had built the house, like for you know, the family kind of thing. And there was times when like the whole basement was his workshop, and if you went down there, you could even feel his presence there. And I had someone who was a builder who I let use the workshop after he died, and a good like 10 years later. And he would go down there to do some work and would just say he just felt someone else down there with him, like the whole time, watching, almost critiquing, because dad was like a master builder. He built houses for a living, right? And just kind of what are you doing kind of thing. And that's wrong, you know, kind of thing like that. And if I would find it uncomfortable, Yet there'd be times when I'd hear things move in the house, or even the heavy footsteps like what he would have, even though there was nobody there. So I think he hung around that house. And one of the most profound experiences I had is a buddy of mine was visiting. I was living in the home, just myself. He was visiting and staying there for a couple of days. And we were talking about, because he knew I believed in the paranormal. And so he was asking questions, and he was talking about Dad a bit. And because he'd never met my father, and he says, well, do you ever think that, he's ever still around or comes back? And when he said that, all the lights in the house went out, but the street lights stayed on. And you could see out the window that other houses had their lights on. And Dad could be a bit of a practical joker. So for whatever reason, I said out loud, like, not right now, Dad. And then all the lights in the house came back on.
Wow.
Yeah. So that'd be the one confirmed visitation I believe that I really actually had from him, kind of thing. And yeah, I thought that was really pretty wild.
Maybe he has a really strong attachment to that house and makes him want to, stick around and see what's going on with the house and trying to take care of it.
I'd really like to figure out a way to go back to the people who've purchased it and are living there now and ask if they've had any activity happen, right? Like if they still feel like there's something there or not, right? I think that would be really interesting to see if he's still there.
That may be a legal issue, because they're going to say, why didn't you disclose that there's a ghost in the place before you sold it to us?
Exactly, right? I mean, we sold it in 2003, so the paranormal wasn't quite as prominent in pop culture at the time. So I think those rules have come in since then. But yeah, I would kind of really, I'd like to figure out how to do that, because I'm really curious if activity has continued on. Like, we've been out of there almost 20 years now. So if they've had anything happen that they can't explain, or maybe Dad was just like, the family's gone, I'm out. You know what I mean? I'm done.
So in your research of NDEs, did you come across negative or hellish NDEs as well?
No, that was the one thing that we didn't come across any that were negative. The closest could have been Angela's case, just because this man in black, like her story, she was on her way to work. Her mom was driving. She was sort of in the passenger seat taking notes. She worked at a hospital, so she was kind of figuring out her day. And they were T-boned, and the truck hit her side and pushed them across the road. And somehow, while that happened, because it was winter, she had a scarf around her neck, and that scarf became caught up in the grill of the truck that hit them. So she was getting strangled with that. And somehow, before she could pass away, at least she could tell, that scarf came undone. But she was in the vehicle, all wrecked. Her mother was not hurt, so she got out to get help. And well, Angela's there, and she's convinced that if she closes her eyes, she's dead. Like that's it. She looks over though, and this literally a man in black is sitting in the vehicle, and he's like all dressed in black. His eyes are black. He's got porcelain white skin and slick black hair. And he's just sitting there and doesn't even look at her. And she kind of asks, like, who are you, kind of thing? And, am I dying? And all the man would really say is, you're going to be okay. It's not your time. But he was kind of a frightening visage, right? Even though he's speaking calmly and everything like that, he's quite scary. And this man in black stays with her while the paramedics come, get her out of the vehicle, load her into an ambulance. He's even in the ambulance at that point and holding onto her hand, saying, it's okay. It's not your time. They get to the hospital. They pull her out of the ambulance. And she's like, where's the man? Where's the man that was with me? And they're like, there was no one else with you. It was just you and the paramedic in the vehicle. But she figures this man gives this man in black credit for keeping her alive, because he was sort of there communicating with her, ensuring she didn't fall asleep, even bringing her comfort. And that one's like, she remembers feeling quite frightened by him and by that experience. But in the end, it was still a positive experience. And that's the closest we got to anything negative. When I was interviewing Lynn Russell, she talked about some that would be where the people felt like once they died, they ended up in like a hell or a place with fire, etc. But literally, that was kind of a hell of their own making. They believed, they were very religious, so they believed that if they weren't worthy to go to heaven, they would go to a hell. And then as soon as they started saying no, or singing, like saying verses from the Bible, or singing, like Jesus loves me, this I know, they would leave that place and go up the tunnel to what would technically be like a heaven. And so those are the only cases where there was anything negative. And those, again, were subjective due to the people's belief system.
So after doing all these interviews and such, have you come to any conclusion about what is the point that we come here and reincarnate over and over for?
Yeah, I'm of the belief system after talking to all these people that we come back to correct, like we're this experience, because when you go to this other side, you're kind of just all part of one great being. Like you have your kind of individual identities, but you're all connected. And it's a big positive place of peace and love and contentment. So we're here to kind of learn about duality and differences, and to kind of experience different emotions and sort out different conflicts, and just sort of to evolve as people. And we come back to correct mistakes we made in those past lives. Because when you're on the other side, you go through that past life review that a lot of people talk about that. And some say it's like a review center, or some say you're just showing your different, experiences. And you see where you've treated people well, and you see where you've treated people poorly, and you get a chance to kind of fix those mistakes, and you feel what the other people feel who you've wronged. So this is all just kind of a way to learn just what it's like to be alive and to be people and to interact with other people. And when you've done something wrong or created a big enough mistake, you get to go back and interact with these people again in a different life, probably potentially in a different relationship, so that you can fix those mistakes. So it's like karma, basically. And once you've kind of fixed your mistakes, you get to move on to that and stay at that higher plane of existence. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense to me, just from the research, from my own experiences. Because it's, when you meet people in life that you feel like I've known this person before, you instantly connect with them, you've just met them, or you meet someone and you just hate their guts with no particular reason why you should hate this person's guts. That's because you've interacted with them before. Like there's these certain souls you do travel with through life, and interact with in various different relationships and ways. And it changes from life to life until you kind of figure out your mistakes and figure out what works, and you kind of get on your right path in life. And eventually that trip does end somewhere. Yeah.
You're the narrator of the UFO Show. Have you ever combined NDEs and UFOs? And what do I mean by that is, have you ever come across anybody who has seen aliens during their NDE?
No, I didn't while researching this book, but it did come up. We talked to a gentleman named David Bettenhausen, and he mentioned how the near-death experience and the alien abduction experience are very, very similar, right? You kind of feel like you've left your body. There's these beings that show up. There's quite often this light. I thought that was really interesting. And that's something I'd like to explore more, I think, if we were to ever write a second book on this subject, because there's a lot of literature about it out there. And he sort of suggested that it's a spiritual experience more than any kind of physical, actual abduction experience. How that fits in, though, to the lore, like I haven't figured that out yet, other than there's people that are having these very similar experiences. I think it seems fascinating to me. How similar they are.
I've had a couple guests that have traveled to what they call the water planet during their NDE, and it's basically obviously fish-like beings on that planet. Can't really say mermaids or anything, but obviously you got to live in water. And yep. I'm pretty sure I've had a couple that during their NDE been in contact with non-human intelligences. I know one for sure that a lady was talking to either God or Jesus. She was basically told she's going back, and then she thought she was going back, and then the next thing she was on a UFO with gray aliens.
Oh, wow.
And then she was walking around, and then they finally said, "You got to go now." And then she popped back into her body.
Wow. And I've heard like just through, having an interest in UFOs as well, that happens quite a bit, right? Like you just, okay, we're done. And you just sort of show up back at home. And sometimes you've even moved, like you're in a different room than when you went to sleep, or it's crazy. And there's people who have had those experiences and look, and there's like Sasquatch on the ship as well, right? Which is a whole different topic of conversation, but it's just enough people are having these experiences that there's something, you know what I mean? There's something to them. You can't ignore them as part of the lore, for lack of a better word, that there's something to it. Like, I mean, did we come from beings from another planet? You know what I mean? Like there's UFOs have been described in the Bible, like, and then the Egyptians talked about chariots of the gods. So they've been around as long as we have. There's even enough sort of research out there to suggest that they first started the different, the Mesopotamian cultures and societies, the Mayans, etc., or at least helped them along. So why wouldn't they be like the beings that we're seeing in near-death experiences?
And I've sometimes thought about that. Perhaps whatever realm that is that we go to, whatever frequency, whatever dimension that we go to once we leave the body, that perhaps ETs also like to inhabit that realm. And perhaps if they're not traveling in wormholes to get here, maybe they travel in that realm at the speed of thought or the speed of consciousness to travel those long distances.
They could, right? And then they kind of pop into our reality by changing that vibrational frequency just a bit. Mm-hmm. John Keel talked a lot about, ultra terrestrials and the I think he called it the ultraverse or something like that. And it's like a parallel universe to ours. And these beings show up in various different forms, be it UFOs or like Mothmen, etc., like these men in black, which are just a bit bizarre versions of ourselves, that they've been interacting with us forever, for whatever reason. He never kind of figured it out. But I mean, that could explain a lot of different phenomenon that we have. And it could explain why these experiences are so subjective too. In theory, if we pass over and when we die into this other realm or have a near-death experience, they would take on the forms of whatever was familiar enough to us that we believed in. If we were, like Jesus, if you're super Catholic, or like a dead relative of yours, if that's sort of more your belief system aligns with that, or that's what you're kind of comfortable with. Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating. Like I think the NDE is just sort of a tip, like with all the paranormal stuff, like ghosts or Sasquatch, they're just the tip of a bigger iceberg. And the answer's out there.
Have you checked out the new Star Trek series? I think it's Discovery.
I've been watching a lot of Strange New Worlds is the one I've been watching so far. A little bit of Discovery. My wife's a big Star Trek fan, so she's seen all the Discovery.
All right. Well, that's kind of interesting. And it's kind of along the same way that now they're traveling, within that conscious realm. And they could, instead of warp drive, they just instantaneously go from one place to another.
Oh, wow. That's sort of in the newer seasons of it?
That's brand new. And I think eventually it breaks and they can't do it anymore. But that's kind of the whole premise of how they're traveling.
Interesting. Just with thought, like we're going to go here, and so they go there.
It kind of, they hook up the engineer to some device and he can somehow go into some kind of conscious realm with some other beings. It's interesting that he have to connect them to like fungi or something. And then they somehow can navigate to where they go. Once that's all figured out, they go from here to there instantaneously.
That's wild. I think I have seen a couple of those episodes because I remember there's some weird monster thing in the drive engine and it would send them places really quick. Yeah. Okay. So I've seen like a couple of them where they were doing that. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's some kind of soft disclosure and finally kind of getting us to the next level through Star Trek.
Well, there's a lot of talk that that's kind of what happens with these sci-fi shows, right? That Independence Day was sort of like a little bit of like, well, if they come, they might not be friendly. So it's to prepare you for the thought process that could happen. Or, when Spielberg put together Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that was very much locked into what the UFO lore of the 70s was about, right? Like it was very realistic that way. And I find that possibility fascinating.
Yeah, I think even that character in Close Encounters of the Third Kind was based on Jacques Vallée.
Yes, yeah. There's the one researcher who was very much they based him on. Yeah, it's neat to watch it again. Like as a kid, I watched and I just thought it was neat because of the spaceships, right? But now, like as someone who's been interested in this stuff for 4 decades, it's kind of fascinating to watch it through that lens. As someone who is like, yeah, they really tried to make that possible. Mm-hmm. Even tying in the disappearance, I can't remember the name of the flight, but all the pilots in the Bermuda Triangle, the aircraft that had vanished, they tied it into that too, where they found the airplanes again. I think that's at the beginning of the movie.
Right.
And then when the ship lands, all the pilots do come out and they haven't even aged. Like they haven't aged at all.
About a month ago or so, there was a release of government reports. I think it was around 1,100 pages of different UFO related subjects. And one of them was about that they were considering nuking the moon and to make a deep tunnel inside of the moon to see if there's a metal that is there, that it's just as strong as steel, but like 1,000 times lighter. And they were also talking about wormholes and a bunch of other stuff. Did you happen to catch those reports that came out?
Not in any detail, because there's so much info that kind of comes out at these things, right? So not like super amount of detail, but I know I've heard different theories about that, like with the moon. They've talked about that before, and then of course the wormhole theory is one of the best ways to explain how a vessel can travel so far. If they do physically travel through space, they just open up a wormhole and go through, kind of like what Frank Herbert talked about in Dune with folding space.
Right.
I know there's theories about the moon that there's an alien base already on there, or perhaps it is an alien base and you go inside, you go inside it. Roland Emmerich made a whole movie called Moonfall about that just recently, which was kind of interesting. So I don't know what I think about the idea of nuking the moon to find out, though. Like, I don't know why we would want to do that, considering how important it is to our gravity. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I think that's just kind of typically human to think of doing something like that, but I hope we don't. Like, not let alone the nuclear radiation in space, right? Like, I don't know.
I have it, and it's somewhere on my Facebook page, but not only was the article there, but it would bring up all those individual reports, and you could sit down and read them.
I think the fact that they're making stuff like that public is amazing, that we've kind of hit that point. I mean, I guess it kind of started with that so-called disclosure a year ago. But I think it shows that the government's been paying attention all along. And that they know that people out there aren't going to just stop talking about it. In fact, it's even more popular now than it's ever been. I think even that the pandemic helped because people were at home and they were pondering these questions. And I think when you have something, it was the biggest experience we've had in kind of our generation. You start to wonder a bit if this is it and what more could be out there. And is there more to life than just this? So I think it's got a lot of more people in a spiritual mindset. And I think even though it's technically supposed to be aliens from another planet, I think that ties into spirituality in its own way, because it's kind of a part of the whole paranormal lore. So I think people are more in tune with wanting to know what's actually going on out there in the world and how it's going to affect them. So if there are beings from other planets or other dimensions coming here, what does that mean? How are they interacting with us? What does it mean for our species and our future? And I think sooner or later we are going to find out all those answers. And I just, hope that it's an amicable experience for everybody. Because if they are from another dimension, that means they've got capabilities beyond what we have, at least as far as we know. If they're from another planet or another solar system or even another universe, well, then they're far more advanced than we are. And I'd be curious to see how we handle that when it does become common knowledge.
Do you think that the majority of ETs out there are good, or all good, or good and bad?
Well, I'm sure it's like people, right? There's a lot of good people and there's a lot of bad people, and there's a lot of people that like to shift back and forth depending on how it suits them. I'm pretty sure that applies to anything. You know what I mean? There's always good and bad. I think the belief that they are all good people with our best interests at heart, I don't buy into that. I also don't think they're all out there to enslave us and turn us into food either. You know what I mean? I think they're just different beings. And I think we have maybe one of the reasons we haven't had more interaction is because they're just more advanced than us. And we're just like that anthill that they pass by. You know what I mean? Like when we walk by an anthill and see a bunch of ants running around, I'm sure a lot of them just kind of go, oh yeah, and just keep on about their business. But there's some, I think, that definitely do interact with us more. And maybe the ones that are trying to influence in some way, because you hear a lot about these encounters where especially it happened during more the 70s, where they'd come and warn us that we're going to destroy ourselves if we keep along this path. Maybe, and it's just a theory, that those are the ones that were more engaged in us from the get-go, or that, were the first to colonize us. The Aboriginals in the US and Canada, and I'm sure everywhere in the world, talk a lot about their relationship with the star beings. So I'm sure that we had a lot more of a close relationship with them back then. And maybe for whatever reason, as we developed on our own way, they've just let us go off and do our own thing, but they check in from time to time.
Where are you on the Bob Lazar story? Do you believe that he's telling the truth or not?
I think that with Lazar, I think he, like any of these things, I think at first he had a story to tell. And I think it was true. But like a lot of people who kind of become a part of something like this, you try to think, for lack, you try to keep that narrative going, I think somehow, and maybe it's just over the years become compounded upon and muddied and whatnot in an effort to just kind of keep himself in the public consciousness and not be forgotten. Maybe some people just become very much addicted to that. But when you watch the early interviews with him that George Knapp did, yeah, I'd say like he was absolutely being honest. But now, he kind of shows up in like Jeremy Corbell documentaries, and it's just like he's trying to keep that story going, maybe beyond the point that it needs to, for whatever reason, even though he keeps saying that he doesn't want the attention, but he doesn't want the attention yet he keeps showing up in documentaries. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's interesting. If you really didn't want the attention, you'd just go away. You'd just let it die out.
That's a good point. Maybe it's not about the attention. Maybe it's about the revenue. If he gets a piece of that, or who knows?
I'm sure that ties in. I'm sure that is it's a big motivator for a lot of people in the end. If you start making money at it, you don't want that revenue to go away, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, I'm pretty much. I mean, you hear that with like Ryan Buell when he was hosting, Paranormal State. That was a big thing, but he still surfaces from time to time trying to do ghost tours and stuff like that, right? I think you kind of like that, right? There's a bit of fame and notoriety, and I think if you do start to really enjoy it, you don't want it to just to end.
Right. Do you think that the U.S. government actually has ships?
I'm pretty confident that they do. I'm pretty much sure that's where like the stealth bomber technology came from, and other, super spy planes. I'm pretty sure that's where these were sort of partially born out of, that technology, right? I think, the Roswell crash was the beginning, and then we've just since then, I'm sure there's parts of the government that they're in communication with these beings, right? And that there's a sharing of technology to help us out along the way. Because some stuff, like we definitely felt like we had a period where we advanced very quickly, right? And now it feels like that's almost sort of stagnated a bit in the last few years for whatever reason. So it wouldn't surprise me that we had the craft, and that craft was used to create all these wonderful new toys that we've got. And maybe now we've just sort of exhausted that at this point, or focused out otherwise. But yeah, I think we definitely have alien craft.
You said something earlier that I thought was really interesting, and that was that Sasquatch was also on an alien ship. And you live in the land of Bigfoot, so what is your take? Do you think there's an actual population of Bigfoot? Big feet? I'm not sure how you pluralize that.
I'm not sure either, actually.
Out there on the ground, because some people do report of seeing, adolescent Bigfoot. Or do you think that there are some kind of interdimensional beings that just kind of beam down from time to time and beam out?
Well, I'm sure, because there had, Albert Ostman talked about his whole experience where there was like a whole family of them, and I'm sure there's a population of these creatures out there in the woods. But the more I've kind of dug into it, I'm convinced that there is sort of a paranormal / supernatural aspect to them. And even like at Skinwalker Ranch, there's been sightings of portals opening and large creatures coming and going. And yeah, they've had UFO experience going on at the same time as Sasquatch have been seen, and some Sasquatch have been seen coming in and out of craft, right? So I think they kind of go back and forth. And I know our Aboriginal culture, especially where I live, talks a lot about, the little people and the Sasquatch and these creatures that come through a doorway between worlds, and they spend time here and then they go back to the other side. So I'm sure it's a creature that kind of just walks on both sides of that plane, and they spend time here and then they kind of go back there, maybe regularly, maybe irregularly, but they definitely pass back and forth. I was very much of the camp, it's a flesh and blood creature, a missing link, blah, blah, blah. But as the more I've dug into it and researched it and just talked to different people who research it and et cetera, that there's more to it than just that. And that it's definitely, there is a supernatural spiritual side to the Sasquatch.
Since you're up there in Canada, have you actually ever met a person who has had a Bigfoot encounter and, will say something like, I'll never go hunting again because I'm just too freaked out about it?
I've met people who have had Bigfoot encounters. It's not been enough to scare them out of the woods, but they definitely have a newfound respect for what could be out there, right? And they just take the precautions to hopefully not have that experience ever again. One of them is a gentleman who is an Aboriginal, and he believed in it before, and then when he saw it, it was just like, holy cow. It's real and it's huge, and it's to experience it, even if it isn't being threatening. It's a threatening experience because it's just something that's so big and just not what we're used to encountering, like at all.
Yeah.
So he goes very much respectful and gives an offering to the woods when he goes out there. You know what I mean? And one thing in his belief system, if you see it, like you go and you don't look back, because if you look back, it can follow you home. So I remember he was telling me where he had his experience and he just got back in his truck and he just drove, and it took every effort to not look in the rear view to make sure it was still coming after him, kind of thing. And he just drove straight back into town.
That's interesting. All right. Besides your book, Dying Light, an investigation into near-death experiences, you also have another book that we didn't talk about, and that's called I Want to Believe, One Man's Journey into the Paranormal. And, well, you kind of mentioned it actually in the beginning, but is that based mostly on your co-writer's experience?
On Peter's experience, yeah, because I met Peter in 2017 when he was the head of Vancouver Paranormal Society. And I was looking for something. I've always been a believer, and I was kind of just reading information, scrolling online one morning and saw they were doing a membership drive. And so I sort of applied, and they brought me on to do an investigation. But he's from the UK. He's been doing this for the better part of 30 years. And he and I put together the documentary series, We Want to Believe. And when we were promoting that a couple of years ago, when we first launched, we ended up on Into the Fray podcast hosted by Shannon LeGros. And Peter was talking about some of his experiences. And at one point during the interview, Shannon's like, wow, Peter, like those stories are amazing. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And Peter's like, well, yeah, but I don't have time and blah, blah, blah. And in my head, because I wrote for newspapers, so I'm a writer, and I was just kind of like, I could totally write that book. Like, I know I could write that book. So when we went off, I phoned Peter up and I said, I could write that book for you. And he's like, oh, well, okay. And then so I messaged Shannon back and I'm like, so are you serious about a book? Because she had just launched Beyond the Fray Publishing at that point. She's like, oh, yeah. So that's what we did for the summer of 2020 is I interviewed Peter all summer, and then I wrote his story as a book. And then it was published just before Christmas of 2020 and sold really well, and people really liked it. And it has a lot of just really good anecdotes and theories about it. And I tell a bit of my story and then how we launched the documentary series sort of at the end of it. And it was a lot of fun to write. And that kind of led to the second book, which was an investigator's archive, which I mentioned earlier too, which was telling just different paranormal investigators and filmmakers' stories and what got them into it and what they think is going on. And we talked, Ken Gearhard, Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters, Kieran O'Keefe, who's a parapsychologist out of the UK and has been on TV shows like, Haunted. I can't remember the exact name of it, but a number of them. Paul Bradford, who was on, Ghost Hunters International. And so just telling their different stories and experiences.
Now that this book is out, are you working on anything else that you want us to know about?
We haven't begun, but we've got a contract for another book, and we're going to focus on residential hauntings and kind of, because there's a way when you investigate, we investigate like, historical sites and commercial buildings and people's homes. And there's a way when you investigate a haunting in someone's home that you just do it a bit differently because people live there. And they have to live with whatever's there. So we're going to write a book. One part of it is the methodology and how we approach it. And then the other half will be just sort of talking about different residential haunting cases that we've been involved in and how we approach them and what the end result was, if there was one. So we're going to start writing that at the end of the summer and then hopefully have it finished by the end of the year so it could come out early 2023.
That's great. Your new book is on Amazon. Is it out only in Kindle or is it out in hardback or paperback as well?
Yeah, there's a paperback version of it there. So Kindle and paperback on any Amazon site that you want to check out. And so far we're really happy with it. We've got a lot of good feedback from people. People really seem to enjoy it. It's still selling really well. And it was really a different book to research and write. And it really, I know for me, it changed my perspective on things quite a bit. And from people who've read it, they really enjoy just this different insight and getting a different look at how the world works.
Do you have a website or is it mostly based off your Facebook page?
Mostly based off of Facebook. So we have a lot of the work I do is on YouTube at the Paranormal Network and also on Facebook, which is the Paranormal Network. But if you search out, at Paranormal Headquarters, it'll come up. And then, of course, the books are through Beyond the Fray Publishing.
Is that Beyond the Fray or Beyond the Frame?
Beyond the Fray. So like, how there's Into the Fray. Well, this is Beyond the Fray kind of thing. Yeah. FRAY. Yeah. Right. Beyond the Fray Publishing. It's my Canadian accent might be changing it a little bit.
Well, I wasn't sure. I was just like, maybe I'm not hearing that correctly. So I just thought I'd ask. I felt like it was Beyond the Fray, but I was like, maybe I better ask.
I appreciate that.
All right. Well, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
I think like with anything, like with all the near-death experiences in the end were very positive experiences. No one was left feeling frightened. You know what I mean? They all very much, and they all look at the world very differently and through a very positive lens. That sort of the world we're in right now, with the way society's set up, is not what the point is. The point here is to be good to each other, to be accepting of each other, and to approach each other with sort of love, kindness, and compassion. And I think I had a lot of trouble with that before writing this book, but I definitely, now that I've written it, that's how I look at things too. Because we're all in this together. And that's the big thing, is like when we all die, we all end up together again anyways. So maybe just approach your day and the people you meet differently and with a little bit more kindness. And, a lot of people are struggling right now. And I think that's just the best way. Don't get mad at them. Don't try to cancel them. Just try to understand where they're coming from and give them a little compassion back.
I think that's a great message. Jason, thanks for being my guest today. I appreciate you, and I wish you massive success in whatever you're doing.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.